Today, I'm going to make myself my own Alpinist GMT, which sounds kind of like a crazy thing to say, but it's all thanks to the good folks over at Namoki. Namoki is a modding company that recently developed a whole Alpine collection, where you can build your own NH35 based watch or an NH34 based Collar's GMT version of the Alpinist. And as an Alpinist fan, they told me about all of this. I was really eager to check it out, so they sent me a whole bunch of parts. And that's why the promotional tag is up as well. Now, as typical with these kinds of videos, I'm going to show you a quick version of the build, and then future Shane will be back here in a few days after wearing it to kind of give you a final opinion on it. And in this case, I'll also wind up comparing it to the real deal, because I actually have two still. I got the white dial version and the green dial JDM GMT. And again, this is just going to be kind of a quick overview of the process. I'm not an expert in watch builds, so don't really come to me for advice. There are a lot more people out there who know a lot more than I do. And I'll put a link down below to someone that did a better job than I did in terms of just explaining everything. So of course, the first thing here is to get the movement out and then get the dial put onto it. But with the NH34s, there's this little metal ring spring thing that sits in between the movement and the dial. And notice here that I picked a movement with the black date wheel, just to match the black dial I picked out. The next thing is that the dial does have two different sets of feet, and only one is going to work with the movement holder here. So you got to figure out which one to get rid of. Which you can either cut off, or in some cases just use pliers and kind of bend it and pull it off. And then file it down a little bit. Once that's done, the dial should just push right into the movement holder. And it's now in position to start adding the hands. Like I said before, this isn't really a tutorial, but one lesson that I can give those that have never done this before is to always remember to pull the crown out and advance the movement until you see the date flip over. Because at that point, you know the movement is set for midnight. And you know where both the minute and the hour hands should be. Now, since this is a Collar's GMT, the first thing we obviously have to do is put the GMT hand, since it's at the bottom. And technically, it doesn't really matter what position you put it in, as you can adjust it later, but I think it's always just good practice to set it at midnight. That, and before you go on to the next hand, it's always good just to look and make sure it's on straight and level. Because if it's not, it's kind of hard to adjust once the other hands are on top of it. And at that point, you usually have to take all of them off and start over if you want to fix something. Now, since this is an Alpinist clone, we are using cathedral hands here. But if you don't like cathedral hands for some reason, you could always pick something else. I mean, it's your watch. You pick what you want. And I am being a little bit extra OCD with this one. After putting on each hand, just checking the position and the leveling. And if you look closely throughout this process, you'll notice that the GMT hand is a little bit behind, as well as the minute hand is going to be about 5 minutes behind when the date flips over. But I think just for the sake of the video, it's best just to kind of move on. And if it starts to bug me later, I can always pop it open and fix it then. And remember, when doing this, you're not an expert watchmaker. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just got to be good enough for you. And I think doing something like this also helps you appreciate a good quality watch, one where everything is perfectly lined up. And I think for some, you wind up getting less critical when you see a quartz second hand that isn't perfectly lined up. Because once you try to put a second hand on, you realize how much skill it takes to get that sucker on there. So they really have to have someone who knows what they're doing and is taking their time, or you have an automated process to get that thing perfectly lined up. Before moving on to the case, I also decided to double check everything once again. And as I said before, both the GMT hand and the minute hand were a little bit off from when the date flips over. But I think it's okay enough just to move on. Now the case here is a little different than any of the others I've used. because this one does have an internal bezel, and then there's the outer bezel and the crystal that attaches to the base of the case with these 4 screw bolts. Never seen it quite like that before, so I gotta get those on, which isn't too hard. And then after that, just put the movement into the case. Make sure it's in there nice and snug. Then it's time for the next hard thing, and this is something I've never done before. In the previous builds I've done, which I think were through DIY Watch Club, the crown and stem were already pre-cut for me. But here, I gotta measure and cut them myself. From what I understand, it's not too hard. Just put it in as is, use the calipers to kind of measure the gap between, and then sort of cut and file that off. Insert the crown back in, and then kind of see where it is, and go from there. Was a little bit nervous doing this, but it wasn't too bad. There was a little bit more of a gap, so I trimmed a little bit more off, and then after that there was still a little bit of a gap. But I think it was good enough to move on again. After that, there's only 2 things left to do. 1, grease up the O-ring, then put it on and seal it up. There was a bracelet that was sent along with the watch, and I'll put it on eventually. But after spending a bit of time doing this build, I first wanted to see how it looked on a strap. And not bad. Pretty sharp. I mean, it does look like an Alpinist. And as typical with these kinds of videos, I'm probably going to stop here. I'll clean up, put the bracelet on, size the bracelet, and then, wear it for a few days, and future Shane will come back and tell you what I think about the watch, and in this case, how it actually compares to the real Alpinist. So, future Shane here. I'm back with the final product, as well as my GMT Alpinist, and the white one's out there somewhere. And I'm back after spending a few days with this one, just to get a good feel for it. Now, after doing this, there are a few things that I would go back and do differently. And I might go back and just kind of redo it now to make it a little bit better. For instance, I noticed that there were a few specks on the inside of the crystal that I could go back and clean up. And I could probably trim off another millimeter or so off the stem to make it a little bit more tighter fit. As well as add Loctite to the crown to make sure it doesn't come off. I still haven't done that, but you should. But overall, I'm pretty happy with this. This is a pretty nice, pretty sweet looking build, and better than most Seiko 5s that are out there. And a lot of that is thanks to its better bracelet and a sapphire crystal. The only thing that I was a little bit disappointed in, at least with this black version, is that the indices aren't that easy to read. I mean, yes, they're polished metal, but on my real Seikos, they are a little bit easier to read. Which might be because of the finishing, or might be because they have a little bit more depth and 3D nature to them. But even with that, I'm still pretty happy with this. And I think building one of these out, not counting any of the tools, comes out to about 450 bucks. Which may be a little bit expensive for just the watch itself. I mean, right now an SSK 023 is a little bit over 300 bucks. Let alone the multitudes of AliExpress GMTs that are out there. But the thing is, and I've said this before, with modding, it's never really about value. Value is never a reason alone to do one of these, because it's more about the experience and the idea of making something more yours. However, this may be a little bit of an exception, because this creates a rather interesting alternative to the Alpinists that are out there. And Alpinist fans should pay attention to that. And it's not just because this thing is cheaper, but because there are some interesting differences here that many of the Alpinist fans might find more appealing. And especially when you compare this GMT mod to the actual GMT Alpinist. But let me explain. Now, the case design here is very similar to that of the regular Alpinist, with maybe a few minor differences. For instance, I think the case here is SKX parts compatible, so the dial might actually be just a little bit smaller than that on the actual Alpinist. I'm not 100% sure on that, but even if it is, it's still pretty close. And here with the lugs, I noticed that the subtle polished inside chamfer is a little bit more pronounced than on the Seiko. Then pair that with their bracelet, which winds up sitting just a little bit lower on the lugs, and it winds up giving this new version a little bit of an Aqua Terra twisted lug effect, which I think is particularly cool. But the major difference here is in water resistance and how that plays into the overall thickness. Now, assuming you did your part right when building it, it only has a reported 100 meters of water resistance compared to the Alpinist standard 200 meters, which really isn't a big deal because honestly 100 meters is perfect for a watch like this. It's cool that the actual Alpinist has 200, but it's not really needed for a field watch. But along with that drop in water resistance also leads to a nice drop in total thickness. So on your regular Alpinist, you're looking at almost 13 millimeters. Then on the GMT version, it's a little bit more of a chunky 13.5. Yet on the Alpine case here, it's only 11.5 millimeters. And remember, that's also with a rather chunky NH34 GMT movement in it. So yes, you are losing 100 meters of water resistance, but I think most of us would give that up for a nicer, thinner profile. The other big difference here is to the dial design, at least when you're comparing it to the GMT. If you guys remember my GMT Alpinist review of the green JDM version, you'll remember that Seiko shifted the design away from the normal Alpinist, where the Arabic indices are now shifted to the cardinal points rather than the every other on the normal Alpinist, giving the GMT version a little bit of an explorer touch, as well as then shifting the date window down to this little porthole thing at the 430-ish position. And if you happen to remember that, you'll also remember that I actually like the new dial design, because I think it gives it a cleaner, more organized look, despite all the extra added GMT clutter. But a lot of you preferred the classic layout in which they just stuck with that. Well, if that's what you want, that's what you can get right here. As well as Namoki kept the date window over at the 3 o'clock without the accompanying Cyclops of the newer Alpinists. Which, as I said, makes this a rather interesting alternative for the Alpinist fans that are out there who weren't quite happy with the way Seiko did the GMT version. And I think that goes for the regular Alpinist out there as well, just for everybody who loves the idea of an Alpinist, but maybe doesn't like a few things, like the Cathedral handset. Here you can completely shift that and do whatever you want. That's pretty much the fun of modding. So, bottom line here, if you're an Alpinist fan and you got the skills, you got the tools, I highly recommend doing this. Especially if there was a colorway like the black version or the blue version that you never got and always wanted. And then for those of you who are just curious about modding, I'd say watch maybe a few other videos before you really get into it. But once you do that, this is the sort of hobby that you just need to kind of get off your butt and just jump into the deep end. No matter how many videos you watch, there's still some things you only learn as you go. Now, I had fun doing it, and I can say that this is my favorite watch I've ever built, at least so far. But as usual, let me know your thoughts on this down below, on the Alpinist, on the GMT Alpinist in general, just let me know. And as always, you guys know what to do down below. Like, comment, subscribe, start the whole video over again, just to help me out here. But I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.